Hey guys, hope you're well. Well, welcome to week 6. We are pressing along with the mechanical objects. We did cars prior week. This week we're at the military museum. Tanks. Not just tanks. We can do things like ATVs and APCs and artillery and all that kind of stuff. Anything military generally with vehicles. Okay. I'm going to show you guys a few things, just show you how to approach some of that stuff, and then we're going to be going back on location to the Tank Museum. I'm going to do a lot of demos there for you as well. Hopefully you guys have figured out the locations of where you're going to go for that. Generally you should be able to find any kind of military museum, or next week we're going to be at the plane museum. A lot of the places have combinations and hybrids of where you can find planes and military vehicles, so that might be a location where you can hit twice and do drawings of both fields. Okay, if you have issues to find those kinds of places, especially with large tanks and stuff like that, and I think reference might be the best way to go. For this week with military vehicles and tanks, we got to start out. This is exactly the same way we do with the cars we did last week, and some of you may have found the cars to be quite difficult. And in actuality, in my own opinion, cars are actually very hard to draw. Tanks, military vehicles, to me are a little bit more fun. The only thing that will throw you off with those is just the general scale and the size. Cars, we're always used to the scale and size of those things every day. Animals we see all the time too. We have giraffes that are a bit tall, but still we're used to seeing those things. It's not every day you see a large tank in front of you. Okay, because of that, and because of the amount of detail and complexities of it, it may kind of throw you off a little bit. More than anything, just kind of stand back and just observe the object in front of you. Okay, remember, like we always said, just kind of decide, have those design decisions of what you want to drop back, what do you want to bring to the forefront. It's all about edits. Okay, keeping the details that you want to keep in there, indicating, vignetting, all that small stuff that you feel like is not quite necessary. So when approaching a tank, this is basically what a shape of the tank is. Okay, we have a cube or a box. It could be longer, it could be shorter. Next shape, cylinder. Another cylinder. What this basically is now a birthday cake with a candle sticking out the side. That's all it is. A box, cylinder, another cylinder. Really simplistic shape in perspective. Now, from this perspective, we're more kind of like looking down at it, and when we're looking at these objects in front of us, we're more eye level and even looking up because you might be sitting down. And so the perspective will be quite interesting and a bit different. So the horizon line will be in front of you, and this will pretty much be the perspective of that tank. Okay, pretty much straight on. All right. Now, when I start with the tank, I start with the main body first. Work my way out into the tank treads. And I start those out with boxes, just the same. I cut them up. And the wheels that we handled for the cars last week is definitely going to apply to our tank treads and wheels. And so we just box them out as we normally would and just kind of fill in those spaces. The details of the treads, also important. A lot of the tanks that I'm going to be demoing for you and tackling will be from the World War II era, Vietnam era. A lot of the modern tanks nowadays are quite different in terms of their shapes and proportions. A lot of them are lower to the ground, whereas the classic tanks are more vertical. They have a lot of flat panels. If you look at the design of a tank, and when you start to design your own vehicle or tank, or even military vehicle, think of it this way. The older technologies didn't realize what they were doing actually when it comes to defense of, let's say, rocket-propelled grenades or other tanks or artillery. If you look at a tank of those classic eras of World War II, their armor is very vertical, stands up straight, slight angles here and there, but think of it this way: when something impacts the side of that, and you have a flat, blunt object impacts it, it's going to penetrate. Nowadays, a lot of tanks are very angled. We have a lot of angles on the sides, the fronts, even on the turret itself. And the reason why we want something that's angled is because when something hits it, it'll bounce right off. Okay, that's why if you look at the progression of, let's say, the classic World War II tank, the Allies had the Sherman tank. The classic Sherman tank were more vertical, and as we progress through the years from 40, 41, 42, 43, and 45, they get more rounded, more angled, just to adjust for those kinds of things. When it comes to designing military vehicles, we also have to think about the weight of it. And so what kind of tank is it? Sherman tank that we just talked about was more of a speed tank. It didn't have a very heavy weapon or the cannon, but it could move very quickly. The German tanks, the Tigers, the Panthers, were heavier but had a huge gun, and so they didn't move around as much. They were more stable, they weighted, they were camouflaged, they were painted in a very specific scheme to blend into the environment, and they just waited for somebody to come and attack. Whereas these guys, they were hunters. They went out and looked for things. So again, the function and purpose of your vehicle. What is it going to be used for? A tank is not just a tank. Is it long distance? Is it close range? Speed, armor, patterning, all that kind of stuff will come into play. Now, like I said, tanks are not the only things you're going to be approaching. You can do things like trucks, boats, motorcycles, ATVs, troop transports, all that kind of stuff. And so the amount of vastness in the military is huge. Next week, we will be doing air vehicles, planes, helicopters, all that kind of stuff. So save that for later. Let's try to do ground vehicles for here, or ground or water. When we're approaching them, simple shapes as we do here, nice perspective and proportions. Keep that in mind, and just be wary of the amount of details you're going to be putting in. The simpler you can make this, the better for me, okay? Repetition of drawing, do a lot of it. Side profile views. Again, every week we start out with something. Side profile views with thumbnails, build up to our complexities. We'll just finish it off that way, all right? So next week we'll be at the Chino Air Museum, which is planes, which is the place that I'll be going to, the classic World War II planes. If you want to attempt some modern day vehicles, you are welcome to incorporate them into your redesign. But just keep in mind that next week will be our last on location trip. All right? Okay, I'll see you guys.
Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to week 6. This is me at the Tank Museum, and this is the one location I was also at for Dynamite Sketching 1 for week 8, just to show you an introduction of what some of the mechanical objects that we can draw are. And today, I'm just going to jump right into some of the demos. We were doing cars last week, and we have a big difference here. Obviously, the kinds of shapes we're going to be drawing and the scale differences are quite huge, and also the function and purpose of the vehicle. Now, with the cars, things were really shiny. We had a lot of bright lights everywhere. A lot of people tend to actually have a harder time with cars than they do with military vehicles for some reason. A lot of that probably is due to the organic nature and just the blends of the shapes of a lot of the cars, and also the proportions. But with the tanks, they're so much more boxier. They're easier to break down, and for a lot of military vehicles, when you're designing them, in the real world, is that they have to be efficient, not too complicated, and straight to the point. And so because of that, things are a lot more easier to kind of figure out as you observe them. So, obviously this is kind of a location that might not be the easiest to find, and for those of you that were able to find something, you could probably find a military museum that might be, connected with like planes or an air museum or whatnot. And so if that's the case, that's great, because that's a location that you might end up going back to, which if you did find a air museum, then that's a place you'll definitely want to come back to, because we'll be hitting planes in the following weeks. But military vehicles, you're not going to find them all over the place, so it's not like every day you would find tanks and military vehicles and trucks and motorcycles all over the place. So it's not an easy thing, but if you have difficulty finding anything, this would be the opportunity just to use online images, books, anything you can kind of pull from. I would start out beginning with some older tech, World War I, World War II, and working your way up through the different kinds of generations of tanks as you go up. I would stay away from the straight modern, like the M1s of the US or whatnot. in the very beginning, and you kind of work your way up to some of the more modern day tanks, which are a bit more streamlined, a lot more angular. It's just a bit more, much like evolution of cars, I guess, with the way we did with the car museum from last week, where the construction of the cars from back then, the 20s and 30s, were a bit more simplistic in terms of their overall shapes. But modern day cars today are the blends and the shapes, the forms are much more streamlined, much more aerodynamic. But it's the same thing with tanks. If you look at particular tanks. This one I'm doing right now is a M60 from the World War II era, and a very heavy kind of iron texture and feel to it, and a lot of tanks back then, especially if you look at this one or even the Sherman tanks of the Allied group. The overall construction of World War II vehicles and even World War One was that the sides of walls and the armors of tanks were very vertical, flat, and boxy, I guess. So when they were hit with rounds, the rounds would do a lot more damage than necessary. So if you look at a lot of modern day tanks, or even the evolution of World War II tanks, is that they start to slightly angle certain directions of their wall structure of a tank or whatever vehicle, so that the round will ricochet off of it in a different angle. Those are the slight kinds of things you'll want to notice here and there. Now, as you can see, I'm starting out with a profile view, and much like we were doing with the vehicles last week, when we're starting out, please do side profile views, thumbnails, simple drawings, just like we were doing with the organic shapes. There is no difference. Again, I'll just repeat those kinds of things just to make sure you guys do them. And when we're doing our side view thumbnails, they shouldn't be overly complex, all the details. And with the cars, we had a lot of lights, a lot of shining stuff, but there can be complexities, but it's at a smaller scale. But once you start to get into military vehicles, and because of how large they are, and because of the amount of complexity and detail there is, you have to be careful. So you really have to kind of push things back into a silhouette shape and pull some of the things up the front. Now we're avoiding trains for the term, and trains to me are either something I put in the very beginning or in between the cars and the tanks. Their shapes, the scale is huge, much similar to a tank, and also like a lot of the indications of details of the bolts and piping and all that kind of stuff are also similar too. But I like to skip that and just go straight into the military because of the similarities of the scale. Now, as I said, with the side profile view, this thumbnail that you guys should be starting with should pretty much be about where I'm at right now. So if you get to this point at, of course, a smaller drawing, finish off that, side profile view, stop. Try again, or from a different angle, or a different tank. So again, keeping it really light on the detail, just the overall shape and form. And when I started this with the marker, when you saw it, it was just really boxy shapes, all rectangles. And much like the cars, the ellipses will be very, very important, and circles and whatnot. They're very hard to. This will be the constant frustration. We have the added difficulty here because not only are we drawing wheels and ellipses, but we got to draw multiple tracks and wheels. So that box technique is going to be very crucial. So again, a lot of the complexity and detail is happening in the track, in the wheel well. And I'll save all my details for that. So proportion, much like the cars we were doing, is a really important thing. I always said this with the animals as well. Proportion is going to be the crucial factor of making things look accurate. And so the height of a tank, the length of it, so can out those wheels. A very important line is going to be the line in between the turret and where the track meets up. And so right where the top of the tank track, the treads are, that horizontal line is basically the halfway point of the tank. And you can split from that line up into the upper body and up into the turret, and then down into the tracks or the treads. So that horizontal line I use as a reference point quite a bit. So now that I've kind of laid out my thumbnail or my overall drawing, indicated a few of the details of where they're going to go. I haven't really gone into too much of the darks just yet, or any of the texture, but still, now I'm just starting to kind of slightly indicate a bit of darks here and there. I'm going to really start to gather my values a bit. I'm going to go in there and reinforce some of those lines. Okay. Again, going back in there. The smaller details now start to pull out. So working large to small, large to small. Never just start detailing stuff without even had created the overall form or a shape of something. Don't lose your place, and definitely have a frame of reference of where you want to kind of start and end. Don't be focused on too much of just the detail at the very beginning. That's really going to mess you up, and it also really just distort the proportion of your overall vehicle. And also just be aware of when do you actually want to start taking it to a final render, where just like I said, you will mess up and that's okay. So just realize when you have, and just kind of move on if you did, and try it again. A lot of indication, the separations of the pieces of the tread itself. To give it a bit of a sense of scale, I will start to include a little bit of the environment. Okay, let me switch pens and we will start to go into some of the darks. By the way, this is a brush pen that I'm using right now here, and if you guys want to experiment a little bit with the different kinds of pens, please do. This is the time now to really get into other materials if you like, and for those of you, obviously, probably should have already played with it, and from taking Dynamic 1 with the colors and such, it's an option, you don't have to, but would definitely play with different kinds of materials, definitely in the ink area. So if there's kinds of brush pens, different kinds of Sharpies or thick felt tips, play with those. So this is just a brush tip, and this gives me a nice kind of variation in line, reinforcing that silhouette. Now, this particular museum has been around for a while, and it's located in LA. This is where I take a lot of my students here, and I'm glad I'm able to show you guys. And it's a nice collection of stuff. These vehicles, a lot of them are rented out into Hollywood films and whatnot, and so they're all operational. They are neutered, so they can't actually work in terms of their turrets and firing capabilities, but they still run. And I've been in this particular tank that I'm drawing right now, and very tight squeeze. This is a 4-man crew tank, again from World War II era. And to be a tanker, you got to be a pretty small guy, and I probably would have fit in pretty well. But like I said, it's a very tight fit, and the driver's perspective of where he sits is actually at the bottom of the body. So pretty much, if you look at this tank, if you don't know where the front is actually the opposite end of where the turret is facing. And so where my hand is pretty much the front of the tank, and that turret is being turned around to the back. And the reason why they do this is because they want to protect the barrel. Whenever they're moving in from location to location, they don't want the barrel to hit a tree or a building, so they'll turn it around, lock it in position, and drive forward. And so that turret is basically faced to the back. and the engine is below the barrel, and the driver sits pretty much at the very front in the main body, in between where the treads are. And then there's the reloader, the shooter, and then the commander. So let me get into some of the darks here. Start a basic crosshatch. Dark to light. And just indications of detail up top. There's a lot of stuff up there, you know, little vents, little portholes, nuts and bolts. All that stuff again is just for just slight indications on the drawing. You know, if you see any kind of graphics, numbering, do indicate those for sure. And of course, you know, constantly move around the drawing from location to location in terms of the parts of the drawing. You know, trying not to focus in on one little area for the whole time. Now, I don't expect you guys to take your side profile views this far. You know, out of the couple pages that you might end up doing of them, maybe just one or two you can play with it a little bit. But remember, we're still just looking for a lot of shape play, understanding proportion, and then, you know, once you start to create your own vehicles, you can use that as a frame of reference to, you know, get a proper kind of vehicle construction, and then start to detail those. A lot of the darks that I plan to put in, that I'm thinking about, is going to be in the darker shadow areas, which will be inside the tread where the main body is. So all that I'll drop down in value. And if you think about it, pretty much the shape of the cake and what I'm trying to show you guys, you know, it's a very simple form, but just a box, cylinder on top, and a barrel. You know, they're all just boxes and cylinders. You probably won't need to use any kind of unique texture. You know, if you'd like to apply it a little bit, you can. Maybe because if you look at the surface, you know, hopefully when you start to approach a vehicle of this nature and take a look at the overall surface of it, you know, you'll notice that the heavy iron is a really heavily textured form. It's got this bumpy kind of feel towards it, and if you want to get that kind of texture applied to it, you know, please try it. For me, I like to just keep things simple and go with the basic crosshatch. But that doesn't mean you can't, you know, go in there and really start to indicate those small, you know, slight textures of bumps and scratches or rust. And so be observant of that. If there are things like heavy patches of rust in a certain area that you want to kind of indicate, put it in. But you're also the artist, you're the designer, you're the drawer, so you can choose whether or not you want to put them in or not. I'm going to start to drop that value in there. Now this is a brown pen, Faber-Castell. You know, you guys have the option of trying with different colors. I have Tron drawing them, you know, drawing with oranges, blues, greens, and they all work really well. Okay, going in there, pushing that gradation, dark at the corners, lighter at the middle. And as you can see, a lot of that construction work is starting to really get pushed back, not really noticeable anymore. And coming back into the wheels. And so when you do a basic laying of your wheels, just again indicate the ellipses within the ellipses, and darken one side of it, show that shadow, creates a little bit of depth. Military vehicles for me were always one of my fun things to draw. But when you guys start to go out and venture out and try to observe some of these military vehicles, no, you don't have to just stick with just tanks. There are many other things out there that are related to the military. So things like motorcycles, things like trucks, transport vehicles, artillery, helicopters. You can approach helicopters, and of course we're gonna save our planes for the very end. But when it pertains to transport or whatnot, cargo, that kind of stuff, it's fun to play with for sure. So try other kinds of vehicles other than just tanks. And even if you don't have a location in mind or can get to, if you're gonna explore online, try exploring vehicles out there that aren't just literally just tanks. So I'm going to start to, again, indicate that environment a little bit, create a cast shadow, ground it in a plane. Now, when I look at this tank from my perspective, I am pretty far back, but even then, because of the perspective, it has a slight perspective on either ends of the tank, on the front and the back, so you can basically see the other side of the treads. You have to be the one to basically kind of flatten things out two-dimensionally, because remember, we're still just trying to understand the shape and the proportions of this tank. We're not trying to get an accurate one-to-one correct perspective drawing, because that's not what it is. It's just a side profile view of understanding of shape and indicating slight details and making sure those are all in place. So if I ever needed to look at a tank and needed to design my own, I'll know the shape distinctly from a side. And of course, the closer you get to this vehicle and the larger it is, the more that perspective gets pushed, and you get that kind of fisheye kind of perspective to it. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up pretty soon. Again, this is the M60. Heavy armor, diesel engine, and relatively, tanks are very quick. Usually they can go about 30-40 miles per hour. Tanks nowadays modern tanks are a lot more user-friendly, I guess. I mean, they're very fast, adaptable to the environment, which is the great thing about treads, is that they can mold to the surface. And tanks nowadays also have things like a lot of modern day technologies, air conditioning for one, but stuff like that, they only really barely use it. But tanks from back then in World War II, didn't have any of that kind of stuff, but they had air circulation. The engines kind of sucked in air and blew out the old air, and so there was always movement inside. So it was hot, but compared to the air outside, you have to understand, with a lot of these tanks that are being fought in the desert right now, like in Iran or Iraq or whatever, it's very hot, desert areas, extremely high temperatures. And so when you're fighting inside of a vehicle that's being cooled down with air conditioning down to a temperature that we like, and then all of a sudden you step out of the tank and you're walking into like a 120-degree environment, it'll shock the system and you'll basically pass out. So in the military, even though you may have those kinds of comforts, a lot of the times they probably won't use them for the safety of the personnel inside the carriers. So a lot of the times they won't turn those kinds of things on. They'll let the heat inside the tank kind of rise and not match it, but still be a little bit cooler for sure, to be where it's bearable and still comfortable, but not to the point where you're being chilled down, because stepping out from, let's say, a 78 degree kind of temperature and all of a sudden stepping out into a 120 130 degree environment, that's, just imagine how much that would just kind of put you out basically. Going in there with the marker, it's a 30%, and just kind of hitting those values, grouping them together a little bit. And again, let that marker dry a little bit and kind of lighten up, and then just go over on top of it again, just to darken up that value. Okay, I'm going to come in with the white, hit one more value, a darker one. I'm going to come in with the white to finish it off, maybe indicate that the decal of the star, a few highlight points. Again, this is not a really shiny vehicle, it's more of a matte. In war, you don't want something to stand out, so the colors and the patterns and the textures will be very low drab, low saturation, and of course very matte, just to let it hide. So you don't want, sparkly things all over the place. Let's get in that star. A few spots of highlight where the sun is really shining on it. Kind of hitting that focal point up on top of the turret, which is where I want to keep a lot of my darks. As you can see, I'm just kind of hitting it a few spots here and there. It's not overly heavy. I'm not drawing with the white at all. I'm not even cross-hatching with it. It's just hitting a few highlight points here and there. Let me create a bit of a frame. As you guys are watching this demo, and when you finish it, do go back to the very beginning, look at it again from how I started with just a basic, simple square shape, and then ending up with what I have now. Just to compare and contrast. Okay. This one's pretty much done. Again, very basic cross-hatching, slight indications of the environment around it, simple forms, hitting a lot of the darker values up on top in the turret, slight indications of the highlights and the decal for sure. And a lot more little intricacies and details, inside the tread area with the wheels, but again, a lot of that is still just indicated with just line work. I probably would have liked to have pushed the focal point a bit more to the front, so that we have a better transition from dark to light, from front to back. But this one I kind of pushed it from top to bottom, and so we have a darker values up on top, lighter values down at the bottom. That's how I kind of pushed this one. If I were to do it again, I probably would go from the front maybe to the back. That would be up to you in terms of how you'd want to push your drawings and sketches and details of how you'd want, how you'd like to approach them. That kind of focal point definitely needs to be thought of earlier on. And so, do you want it from the front? Do you want it from the back? Up on top? Where do you want to go? So this is the Sherman tank I was talking about, and as you can see, a lot of the armor is very vertical, flat. There's an angle at the front, which is where they learn from, so if it was hit from the front, those kinds of rounds and shells would bounce off and ricochet and go in a direction where it wouldn't harm the tank. But if you have a flat surface like the side and you have a round that impacts it right on, of course there would be a lot of damage. Now, to take down a tank, the easiest thing to do would always be going for the treads and the wheels. And if you guys seen World War II films or anything like that, and their approach and tactics of how they would take down a tank would be to use sticky bombs and such to apply to the wheels and blow those out. And so if the tank can't move, then it can't do anything. So I'm going to approach this Sherman tank now, and again, just kind of observe how I'm going to just start and keeping things extremely simple initially, okay? Or a very basic form of a box. Now the Sherman tank can be a little deceiving. It's a very simple form. It is still just boxes and angles and shapes. However, the problem with it is it's very vertical. It's a lot more vertical than it seems. And so a lot of the times when people draw a Sherman tank, they'll get the proportion a little bit too extreme or not extreme enough, and a lot of times it can end up looking like a toy, or it can end up looking a little weird just scale wise, but also they might compensate for that and end up flattening the tank quite a bit. So I'll start usually with the box shape of the front plane of the tank. So this is our first recorder, and I'm going to start with that front plane and then get in that side plane. And so I'm eyeing my perspective here. Now you can create a horizon line, give yourself a angle of perspective. This is a 2-point for sure. Now don't plot out anything, that's going to take you a lot of time. A lot of this I'm just eyeing and judging as I go, indicating a few spots here and there with line work, where things are going to go. So I'm creating a lot of reference points of areas of where placement needs to happen with proportion, so nothing is left to chance. None of this should be guessed. It's not like you're trying to guess your way through how this is gonna look. You need to construct everything, okay? Construct it all. Basically, take the idea of having a piece of block, whether it be rock or wood, and you're cutting away at it, finding those angles and shapes. You start out with the basic form, and with sculpture obviously those forms will go away because you're chipping away at those pieces, but with the drawing that construction remains, and it's great to have it there because it's good reference points to again find that perspective. So from here I'm finding that first tread, which is the one closest to me, so it's easier to kind of figure out, and I'm going to indicate those wheels really quickly. So I found an overall box shape first, slightly indicated the height of the turret. Now I'm just indicating those wheels because a lot of the times people leave those wheels to the last moment, and so they'll construct the body, figure out the fenders, the turrets, the barrels, all that kind of stuff, and they get it really good and they're really happy with the drawing, and then you got to get to the wheels and you hesitate, and that's where you mess up. To me, I think it's best to actually go for the wheels first because then you get it out of the way. So the Sherman has this really unique, distinct angle at the front. And the way I started that, again, we're still starting with a very boxy shape, but I'm just cutting away at it. Remember, when you start with a more simple shape like a box, you can continue, even if you cut away at it, you can continue to add on it as well. And so if I have a box shape, and if the treads of the tank extend out beyond it, then I can add those shapes onto it, much like a piece of a Lego or something. So I like to think that way three-dimensionally in my head, where I have a box shape and I see it on paper, but in my head I can take those shapes and cut away with it using just kind of my own imagination, or just, I guess, in my head, and to be able to construct it all out, and then not really figuring it out on paper, figuring it all in my head first while I'm thinking about it, and then once I figured it out, then I start to approach it and draw it. That, of course, is not an easy thing to do, and a lot of people will struggle with that, and so a lot of people will tend to make that mistake of just figuring it out on the paper. And as I always say, it's like, don't, and I've said this before, don't think while you're drawing. Think first, figure out your game plan, and then draw it. Never try to guess it. This is a very strict formula, following the rules, and as long as you stick with those kinds of general steps, you shouldn't be able to mess it up or need to guess something. So I'm starting with the main body first, went to the tread, went to the other side, and then eventually I'll go up into the turret and the barrel. Going up into the turret now, and this, the shape on this one in particular, is easy, really, for the Sherman. It's quite easy to figure out. It's a very rounded kind of square, and that's the unique thing about the Sherman as well. It's a boxy form, but there aren't really too many harsh, sharp edges or lines. There are a few just on the corner of the body, but overall the Sherman has an overall look of a very rounded, organic kind of machine. A lot of intricacies of the hatch, little things up on top. A lot of that stuff I'm just kind of indicating with line work. If I miss a few things, that's okay. I'm going to figure out that barrel. And to get the barrel, to me, when I want to find the length of it, I'll just draw a reference point from the body and just draw a line, and then wrap that cylinder around it. Don't just try to start with drawing a cylinder. Find out the length and proportion of that barrel first, and then put your shape on top. Now, the Shermans in general, if you look at a lot of the World War II tanks, the Allied side, which we had a lot of Shermans, weren't very powerful. The turret, the barrel itself, we had, the rounds weren't very big, so the barrels were short, they were more of a close distance, but they were lighter and a lot quicker, so we could move. We had the mobility is what we had an advantage of, so we could go from location to location and also kind of attack really quickly. The German tanks, the Tigers, the Panthers, the Leopards, and whatnot, heavier, much bigger barrels, more powerful. I mean, they're known for their blitzkriegs and being able to move in on locations quickly when they were initially, taking over territories. But once they started to defend, when the U.S. started to come in, the distinct things with the German tanks is that they had a very unique kind of texture and pattern on top of their tanks to hide them, in the urban environment or in the forest, which the Allied tanks did not. They were basically just green, a drab green. But that was the advantage they had, was that they had camouflage, much more powerful armament, more experience too. And a lot of the times when we would have to the Allied have to take over a location, a town, those tanks would just kind of wait in location, just wait for them to kind of approach, and they would be hidden under tarps that were the same kind of camouflage, and it worked to their advantage quite a bit. But then eventually, as the war went along, the Allies started to improve on the Sherman tank, and so there were about 4 or 5 variations of upgrades from the year 1940s to about 1945, 46. There are about 3 or 4 generations, and each one subsequently got strong, more powerful with the kind of turret on it, the kinds of engine it was using, the strength of the armor, and so whatnot. So they became pretty much comparable to the German tanks by the end of the war. This location, this museum, has a pretty cool collection. They have a lot of different stuff, really rare piece too. They have a Japanese tank from the Pacific. Those ones are extremely difficult to kind of locate. A lot of the machinery, the tanks and whatnot, from the Germans or the Japanese were destroyed, so they really don't exist anymore. There are a few pieces left here and there, especially on the Japanese side. The tanks and the planes, not too many left, so it's rare to find them, and it's really hard to see them in person. But in this location, they do have one Japanese tank, really interesting to look at. The form and the shape is quite unique. The texture, the paint pattern, really cool looking. But a very small tank, very light, thinly armored. So a lot of my indications of details going into the wheel well right now, the treads, and there is a lot of complexity in there, and you want to hit as much of it as you can. The closer you are, as it comes to the foreground area, that's where you want to kind of focus and make it a bit more accurate, and as it kind of pushes back into the background, then you can kind of indicate it slightly and just kind of show that something's there. As you can see, you can still see it be a very just simple line drawing. You can see the overall shape and form. You can still see some of the construction. There's no shadows, no line variations. Everything is pretty much even throughout. But because of that, it still feels very flat. Now, from a 3/4, if you guys wanted to take it about this far, I think that would be good as a study. Of course, at a much smaller scale, and then eventually, as you want to practice or even take it home and try to finish off 1 or 2 of them, then you can start to take it as far as I will. For this particular week's sketch, and even also in your redesigns, the sketching aspect of it is more on the mileage side of you guys just doing things observationally, figuring things out in proportion, perspective, all those kinds of things. And once you start to get into your redesign, that's where I like you guys to push the whole dynamic aspect of it, seeing it in an environment, being used, or interactions with people, that kind of stuff. So right now I'm actually doing the actual tread part, and each tank has a very unique patterning, distinct shapes within the segments of the tread. Some are much more complex than others. I think I'm pretty much going to finish out with this demo here. Both of these are going to end up a little bit long, but also I'm taking it to the furthest that I can on location. And because the kinds of machines that we're going to start to approach, even on the military side and eventually with the planes, is the fact that the more complex the shape is, obviously it just takes more time to draw it. Even though I may understand the forms really well, just to actually draw the pieces, it just takes some time. I think I would probably say it was in this location, drawing a lot of the military vehicles and tanks, is where I started to learn how to hide a lot of my mistakes as I continued to grow and gather experience, with, and when I say mistakes, a lot of it has to do with the line or the proportion of certain things, and you know, with animals, I was more of an organic person, I think, and I really worked on the mechanical aspect of it, and tried to get a lot of confidence behind it. And so when I got to the mechanical side, I messed up a lot. You know, proportions of things, the kinds of stuff I was talking about. And so I'd have to learn how to start to hide some of the mistakes I would make, whether it be in the overall shapes and forms or even in the line quality, and learning how to just kind of incorporating those mistakes and making it a part of it, and then look like it was done on purpose. Those kinds of things I think every artist does, because no matter what, you're gonna constantly make mistakes. You're gonna find things that you just didn't hit the way you wanted to, and so everybody eventually learns how to play with mistakes and know how to use them to their advantage. So I'm coming back in here with the brush pen, and I'm going to start to create that line variation a little bit, have some thick and thin lines, because overall it's still, it's detailed, but the line weight is all similar. There's no real shadows or darks. I've indicated some of the cast shadows and shadows. It has a kind of nice feel towards it, but I definitely still want to push the line variation a little bit, pop that silhouette from the paper, and then start to get into some of the darks. Now this method of drawing that I'm doing here is something that I use in the industry all the time, and it's just the way I draw too. You're gonna notice that once you guys continue with this style technique of drawing, and you guys have taken Dynamic 1 already, and I don't know if you've already kind of noticed it, the influence will always be there. This method of drawing, when you just start to approach things, when you design things, whatever project you're working on, this kind of Viscom style in the ID style will come into play, and it will influence you greatly, I think. And the more you do it, the more mileage you rack in, the more and more it'll kind of bleed into your style, I guess. And so, one of the first projects I worked on was Warhawk for the PS3, and they brought me in to do vehicle designs for it. And a lot of the vehicles, were tanks or light tanks, jeeps, and trucks, and a lot of them were very nostalgic. They had a World War II era kind of feel towards it, yet still with a twist. And so that project felt very natural to me. It was easy to do because, again, I did a lot of this kind of drawing in class, and developed my sketching skills and design skills of understanding what actual, vehicles during World War II were like, the feel of it, the texture of it, the weight, and because I had experience of just understanding what they were like in person, that definitely helped me design vehicles in the industry on an actual project I needed to work on. And so when I was working on that project, I didn't do things digitally. Actually, I drew those vehicles out on paper with pencil and pens. I drew it with pens on a vellum type of paper with the same kind of similar construction that I'm doing now. I applied that pencil technique to get that kind of textural feel towards it. And on vellum, you get this really kind of nice heavy, it's interesting, it makes it look like a heavy iron texture. And then I will scan those piece by piece and color them digitally in Photoshop. So with this pen, I'm just basically going back and reinforcing those shapes, adding some darks, thins, dark lines, thin lines. And adding a little bit of contrast now. So if there's ever a question about, will I be able to even use this, in the industry, do I even use it myself? For sure, absolutely. Even today, as I continue to design new things, this method of drawing still comes into play of just overall shapes and forms, layering techniques, pulling details, indications, just so I can get my sketch ability quick, and then being able to concentrate on details of just painting it or finishing out the design afterwards. Which is the whole point of the sketching and drawing. What we're trying to do is that we're just trying to get an overall shape or form, indicate those details so we have the information in place, and then come back, and so if we need to render those parts out, then we can. So I'm indicating my focal point, where I want to control it. And I still do that circle a lot of the times, mainly because it's just for myself to understand where my focal point is going to be. And much like anybody else, I can also lose track of where I want it. I may think of ahead of time where I'm going to put things, but it's just because, sometimes I'm thinking of something else, or I'm doing, drawing other parts of sections, and I'll just forget. And I'll start to detail all over the place. And a lot of students do that constantly. And I've made that mistake, and I still do. So that's why I gotta give myself borders or places where I know to keep a lot of my details and overall indications of contrast and darks and shadows. So I'm just kind of going in there and adding a slight indication of the shadows, a little bit of cross-hatching. And I think this week's redesign should be a lot more fun than the cars. I think the cars, doing a redesign from them can be a bit challenging. It feels a bit limiting, I guess. Really not a lot of things to play with. I guess you can just kind of redesign a car or whatnot. But with the military vehicles, the kind of variety of vehicles that exist in the military is vast. So you can definitely play with the function and form of the reason why you're designing this particular vehicle. And let me explain a little bit more about that. When you guys are approaching your redesigns for your military theme, definitely do think about the function and purpose of that particular vehicle. That's going to be the first and foremost of okay, why you're designing anything anyways. But especially with the military vehicles, you're going to need it just to give yourself a really clear direction of where you need to go. And every vehicle in the military has a very distinct purpose. Nothing is just created just because it looks cool. Much like a soldier, each vehicle has a job, and it needs to perform that job to its utmost capability. And so when you guys are designing something for the military, you think about that. It's like, okay, what kind of vehicle do I want that performs to its best? And so is it something that is used for assault, something used for defense? Is it transport? Is it even medical, cargo? And if you guys want to push the fantasy a little bit, if you want to go sci-fi, you can. Maybe if it's like a steampunk kind of theme to it, or if you want to stick with the World War II theme and create some kind of unique vehicle within that era, you can. And if you want to break out of that and try something a bit more modern, go ahead, that's okay. I'm not saying don't look at modern tanks of what we have today going on. Do observe them, kind of compare and contrast of what exists and how it evolved. And then from there, start to just sketch things out and create a good story for yourself. I don't do it here, but if you want to start to include a little bit of the interaction of the human being, you can by designing what the drivers can look like. And I'm not saying, do full-on drawings or sketches, and it could be just a small little silhouette next to your vehicle, a slight indication of what that person could be like, whoever drives that thing around. And when you guys are, sketching and drawing for the mileage aspect of it, you guys shouldn't just be doing the vehicles. Observe. I mean, as you guys do the overall shapes and forms first, after you get some of that stuff done, go in there and start to observe closely. A few of the parts that are, the joints or the segments, the wheel itself or a section of a tank, just parts in general. Things like an engine, or what does even the round of a tank look like, a shell round. Those kinds of things you should just really research or even look online if you want to, if you don't have that kind of stuff on location. Some interesting books to look at, I think, would be books that I grew up with. I think are really cool. I can't remember the name of them, but I'm sure a lot of you guys would understand what I'm talking about. There were books for children actually, and they would take planes, cars, or tanks, or ships, and they would draw them accurately. And then what they would do is cut them in half and show the internal parts of it and how the people, the floors or the sections of a vehicle, and how people sit or interact with things. And of course, I'll talk more about that in the Q&A once I can find out the information for it. But if you guys know what I'm talking about, then I'm sure that's something you're definitely thinking of. Alright, going in there with the light value marker, adding in and grouping those values together again, like I usually do. Now this is a pretty dark value marker. I would suggest you guys maybe use a 5. This is a 7 I'm using right now. It's a bit dark. It's hard to get a nice blend with it. Okay, let me go in there and indicate a few of the highlight points. And so for the homework this week, as usual, I'd like to see 6 pages of military vehicles on location, if you can provide that, and of course our redesign. And the redesign will be military themed. Just think about the function and purpose of your vehicle. And you could definitely do some really unique things with this. And I've seen some creative designs, definitely for sure, from a lot of my students. So kind of take it slow. Just make sure to make that first decision. Make sure you get that down quickly, and don't spend too much time and just kind of thinking about what am I going to do, what should I do, and spending like 3 days on that, and all of a sudden finding out you have a couple days left to flesh this thing out. We only have a week, and so that first step of just deciding what you need to do is going to be really important. So please decide. Now remember, when you guys are doing your redesigns, they don't have to be sci-fi or realistic. If you want to push it towards a stylized or cartoony side of it, you're more than welcome to. But the approach of the drawing, the approach of the process should all be the same throughout. Okay, this one's almost done. I'm gonna hit a few more spots here, drop in that value of the background. Definitely good luck with this, take it slow. I think a lot of you guys are going to enjoy this week a lot more than maybe some of you did with the cars. It's just a lot more fun to observe some of these kinds of military forms. Don't be afraid to push some of those darks. I think that might be one of the last things I like to do is come back and just hit it really hard. So there you go. Okay, good luck this week, and I'm looking forward to see what you guys do. All right. Okay. Just to reiterate some of the few things again, when you're looking at this, the overall construction of that box shape is still there when you look really close, but it starts to fade back and is not as noticeable because of the darker value of the markers and the cross hatching and the slight indications of details. There's a lot of complexity in the wheels and the tread areas, but again, that overall box construction and the line work is still there and very apparent. But again, it's all about reads, it's about layering, it's about indications of where you want the eye to see. And so a lot of that grouping of values up on top of that darker value. And so again, creating that focal point, very important. And so try to give me a lot of that, good control of focal point, and go from there, okay? Alright, thanks you guys.